Hello everybody, it's vanburman here. Today we're going to be taking a look at the HD 7870. You will have seen this in a previous video where I cleaned it and failed to get the fans working again. But nevertheless, here we have it. This is the 1 gigahertz version by Sapphire, and obviously it's an ATI card, and it originally came out on the 5th of March in 2012. Looking at the comparisons for the time, it looks like it was pretty much in direct competition with the GTX 660, which is a card that I had previously back in the day, and one that I'm sure we'll have to do a comparison on further down the line. I got this for around £24 off of eBay. Of course, I didn't realise that it had the issue with the fan, which apparently is quite common, looking at the various forums and what have you. But it does automatically come on if you set the fan curve to around 80, or in the 80s. The interesting thing about this card, other than the 1 gigahertz core, is that we also have the 2 gigabytes of VRAM, which will be a bit of a change to the cards that I have looked at most previously, and it gives it that extra bit of headroom, for example, over the GTX 460, and I'm expecting it, and I know that it performs better than that in many cases. But that also brings me to the point that where this card fits in with my testing, it doesn't, well, we'll see, but you know, it's sort of a middle child, shall we say. I suppose it's just of that generation where it's not you know, modern enough to be really good at the new titles, but then it's also not old enough where it's not going to absolutely demolish the less intensive games. So anyway, let's see how it does. I'm also rendering and recording this video on the 7870, so yes, presumably I'll let you know how that goes as well. So, starting with the easy benchmarks, we've got War in the North playing in the background. I thought a troll, not in the YouTube comments this time, but actually in this particular video. So, the scores are relatively unsurprising, I would say. The only one that was a bit of a disappointment was Rocket League, in terms of the actual scores, but in reality it ran perfectly well, and I'd be more than happy playing Rocket League at, you know, with VSync on at 60 FPS. No issues whatsoever. Also ran Shogun really well. Also, quite easily play that on high 1080p. And if you're playing the normal course of the game, you wouldn't obviously notice any real difference in that one. But it scored quite highly in both sets of benchmarks for this. Obviously, the Rocket League 1% low did let it down. But yeah, if you want it for any of these sort of games, pretty much any DirectX 9 game, you are doing really well with this one. So unfortunately, the footage I recorded for the medium benchmarks being Doom, I've just checked it and it's basically a slideshow, despite the fact it was recorded from the medium benchmarks, which obviously ran at a near flawless 60 FPS, and yeah, the 1% low means that it was very, as you can probably tell, very smooth. So the main takeaway from these are that, you know, it can run the games at ultra, many of them, but not particularly well. So if we move them down to medium settings, even high settings in some cases, we can actually get some pretty decent playable frame rates, you know, where you might actually be okay with sitting there and playing a full gaming session with this, which is quite nice to see, quite pleasing. I imagine that you know, the extra VRAM there, you know, having a 2 gigabyte buffer rather than just the 1, for example, in the 460, really does make a good amount of difference. So we move on to the low spec hard benchmarks, which I've, for comparison's sake, drawn up against the two best cards that I've tested so far in the GTX 460 and the GTX 275. Now obviously we can pretty much discount the GTX 275, it is much older, much more severe hampered by drivers and what have you, and as you can see, the 7870 wins out on top on pretty much everything. Skyrim is an outlier because of the fact that unfortunately VSync was uncapped for that particular run, but the average obviously would have been 60, pretty much the same as the 7870. and yeah, it performed really well. I also did some further benchmarks, which I've not graphed up, but they are running the games like Witcher 2, for example, on medium and high settings, just to see, you know, the best we can get for between 40 and 60. And actually, it's on high, I believe, now for the footage in the background, and I would be more than happy playing The Witcher 2 on high on this particular card. So from The Witcher 2 to The Witcher 3, a generational increase in fidelity required, and the 7870, you know, did struggle with this on Ultra, you know, as to be expected, and as it did with Metro 2033 and also Final Fantasy 15. So I'll be honest with you, I wasn't too surprised by these results, but it does mean that, you know, it gets a maximum score for the overall, which is not great for this, because I don't deem any of those particular scores to be playable. We did have a look at, you know, giving it the same treatment as we did the medium benchmarks, and actually, you know, how well do these games run at a more conservative setting. And as you can tell, they're all very much playable. Even with, you know, The Witcher 3, we've got 1% lows above 30 frames per second, with Metro 2033 being very close as well. You know, you could quite happily play these and have a, I hesitate to say it, console-like experience. But yeah, it's something that I would be more than happy to use under these circumstances. And I think if you still had the card, you probably shouldn't be too worried about what you'd want to play. I mean, of course, you could even increase the odd setting as well, potentially. Going forward, I've decided to include a random game to benchmark with various settings. This time it's the turn of Mountain Blade 2 Bannerlord, and I did the medium and low settings, and both were more than playable. You know, it's a far cry from the problems with the GTX 460, all the textures loaded in and what have you. I think it was probably to do with the VRAM buffer, and actually performed quite well. Now we'll see the synthetic benchmarks, if you are of course interested in that, and I'll be honest, I haven't indeed checked, so I presume these are roughly where we should be with them. At some point I'll do a comparison, I'm sure. So here we have the overall points scored, and as you can tell, it did a lot better in the low spec, and actually got a score under 50, which I would deem to be perfect. But unfortunately the normal course was just too high, and it didn't really, you know, sort of didn't feel as though it fit into that category, mainly because of it scoring the maximum on the high benchmarks, and obviously therefore none of the games being deemed playable. When we compare it to the GTX 460 though, it does surprisingly, I suppose surprisingly well in one regard. Beat it out in pretty much, well, in the overall category and in the hard category. You know, for the easy and the medium benchmarks, we are talking literally a couple of frames difference between the two. And with Skyrim letting the GTX 460 down so much, you know, there was a huge, you know, gap there for the 7870 to take the lead. And once again, you know, I'm not showing you anything that you shouldn't already be aware of. And yeah, you know, it performs quite well, and I guess that sort of leads me quite nicely onto my final thoughts on this. I think for the price that I paid, if you can get one similar that is, you know, in full working order, then you should be quite pleased with that. If you don't already, you know, own a sort of low to mid-range graphics card, you know, if you already have something like the 460, I think it's definitely still viable. But yeah, if you were to, you know, sort of to move it to this card or something around here, you would definitely be in the scope of pretty much being able to play whatever you want with, you know, some sacrifices. And I think going forward, it will be quite interesting to see if we can get a GTX comparison with this, you know, proper head-to-head with the 660 or the 660 Ti, you know, one of the two, and, you know, just seeing how that fares, because they're very similar in many aspects. But yeah, you know, I'm just be honest with you, I'm just glad to get off the test bench. It's been on here for ages. As you can see, I've got the WD Black in there. I did the whole game drive and moved all my games there and what have you. So yeah, these should, you know, should be a bit more straightforward and more games to test, which will be nice. Anyway, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope you enjoyed the video. As always, feel free to vote on a poll that will be in the community tab for the next card. And yeah, I've had fun producing it as always. See you next time, guys. Bye for now.